I'll try not to go too much into detail because capoeira history dates back hundreds and hundreds of years. So capoeira began around the 16th century, mostly by African slaves who were brought in from Africa, mainly from Angola, but from other parts of Africa as well. They were brought to Brazil by the Portuguese colonists at the time, because Brazil used to be a colony of Portugal, I think, until the early 19th century. The main trade in Brazil at the time under the Portuguese was sugarcane production and tobacco as well, and depended mostly on the labor of slaves. So these slaves were kept in very inhumane condition. They were forced to work, 7 days a week in the beginning, and suffered really bad physical punishment and for any kind of small behaviors. Actually, many of these African slaves didn't make it to Brazil because of the inhumane conditions that were kept in the boats that brought them, or the ships that brought them in. They stayed weeks on end, in the belly of the ship, nowhere to use the washroom, nothing like that. So really, really terrible conditions. And even though that slaves were numbered, they were outnumbering the colonists, rebellions were very rare because of their lack of weapons, the harsh colonial rule. Obviously, many different slaves came from different African cultures. They don't all have a knowledge about the land, or the languages were different. And all of this usually discouraged the idea of a rebellion. So in this environment, essentially, capoeira was born as a simple method of survival. Yeah. It was a tool in which an escaped slave was able to survive in a hostile unknown land, and later on also use it as a tool to escape or fight against the masters. So what would happen is that the slaves were able to escape. They were usually chased by the capitães do mato, which was the armed and mounted colonial agents. I guess they were charged with finding all the captured slaves. And soon after, several groups of escaping slaves would, once they escaped, they would gather and establish quilombos, which would be essentially primitive settlements in the far and very hard to settle, parts of the jungle, because back there Brazil was even more jungle than what it is today. And some of these quilombos, these slave settlements, freed slave settlements, would grow into enormous size, becoming essentially independent multi-ethnic states. And since everyday life in Colombo offered a little bit more freedom and opportunity to revive some of these traditional cultures, origin villages or countries where they came from in Africa, capoeira started developing under those conditions. And essentially, because these quilombos were constantly threatened by the capitães do mato, capoeira developed even more so as a martial arts and a survival tool that was also focused on war. Actually, the biggest quilombo, the Quilombo dos Palmares, was consisted of many villages, which lasted for over a century. And I think they resisted like around something like 24 smaller attacks and 18 big colonial invasions. And there's actually many stories in capoeira about some of the fighters that defended these quilombos and helped to free slaves and so forth. And obviously, throughout the hundreds of years, capoeira as any art form started, taking different elements from different martial arts. Capoeira actually changed quite a bit from what it was hundreds of years ago until what it is today. And then actually in the end of the 19th century, I think, when slavery was abolished in Brazil, I think it was 1888, many of the freed slaves, they suddenly became free, so to speak, but without any means to support themselves. No money, no food, no shelter. So many of them either became criminals, robbers, started forming gangs, or working as essentially bodyguards and thugs for hire, so to speak, for some crime lords, because back then life was a bit harder, even harder than it is today in Brazil. So capoeira actually became illegal for a while, and I think it was in 1932 that a very famous capoeira master by the name of Mestre Bimba, who actually saw what's going on with capoeira, it became a little bit more playful. It felt like capoeira was losing a little bit of its martial arts aspect and more of its tradition. So he is actually the first capoeira teacher to bring capoeira into the academy. He developed a belt system. He developed a uniform. He made capoeira look a little bit more, so to speak, legit. Especially in a more modern, growing Brazilian society, so to speak. and he was getting a lot of people from from higher socioeconomic classes,
Right.
which obviously was able to get him a better exposure. He didn't call in the beginning. He didn't call his school Capoeira. Didn't use the name Capoeira because of still of the it was not really legal to do so. He
Mhm.
called the Luta Regional Baiana, which means the regional fighting style of Bahia. But shortly after, he got more exposure, and I think it was in the late 30s that capoeira became legalized or became decriminalized, and then from there it just started growing exponentially. So a lot of capoeira that we play today is actually owed to Mestre Bimba. He helped make capoeira a little bit more into the format of what many capoeira schools have today. But the capoeira history is super, super, super rich and diverse. There's actually a lot of information we don't know. So I might perhaps I'm wrong with some details because much of the information about capoeira was passed from father to son, from teacher to student, because especially after the abolition of slavery, a lot of the records were destroyed.
Yeah.
So to cover up a lot of terrible things that happen. So many things, every time somebody tells a story to their student or to their son or to their daughter or to whatever, or to their child, there's some information there's been maybe changed,
Yeah.
lost, missing, you know.
Hmm. It's that historical game of telephone for sure.
Yep, 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 yep. From the first to the 10th person, there's only maybe 10% truth.
Yeah, I knew some of that information, particularly pertaining to how it was illegal for a time. I didn't realize that it was so connected to colonialism. It kind of reminded me a bit of blues music in that way, where um, it was kind of as a means of survival, but for very different reasons. Capoeira was definitely more for survival against to fight against the system, and then blues was just to like kind of cope with it. I
Yeah,
think that's a
yeah.
very interesting contrast I was making while you were discussing this. That I felt like sharing.
You're absolutely right. Even actually, even before then, even in the 16th and 17th century, when slavery was still obviously everywhere there, the slaves in the beginning, the slaves had to work 7 days a week.
Yeah,
But when the Portuguese colonists realized that they need to have it one day, at least one day a week off because they were dying.
yeah,
They were just dying. They were not dying because of necessarily exhaustion, but just exhaustion. But they were dying just because they were burned out and because they're when you work 7 days a week, 18 hours a day, you don't really have a desire to live. But then they give them one day a week, and for a lot of them, that one day a week was the ability to practice some of their folkloric dances and traditions and just have a little bit of an outlet, and
yeah.
in the midst of that, the many aspects of capoeira developed as well.
That's really, really interesting, and there's a lot to go into there, but
If you want to hear more stories, don't forget to subscribe, comment, and like. To support more youth by youth led projects, visit us at youthspeak.ca where you can donate and spread youth mental health awareness.
Youth Speak Charity. Speak, inspire, change.